Let's talk though about the Spring Statement because it's been the very big news this week, hasn't it? Rachel Reeves covered quite a lot. It wasn't a budget; it was definitely not a budget, but it was still there was quite a lot to kind of get through as she tried to make some cuts to get that financial headroom back, prepare the country for any future economic shocks, and live within her fiscal rules. Here's what she told her fellow MPs.
The global economy has become more uncertain, bringing insecurity at home as trading patterns become more unstable and borrowing costs rise for many major economies. Mr. Speaker, the job of a responsible government is not simply to watch this change. This moment demands an active government.
Now, we talked a bit about this yesterday, but of course, sometimes it takes a few days for everyone to kind of read the detail, understand a bit more about what was kind of in the fine print. We did hear during the Chancellor's speech that the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, halved its growth forecast for the UK economy this year to 1%. Steve, that was interesting because it did halve its growth forecast, which is not what the Chancellor wanted to hear, but it's still actually a bit more optimistic than some of the other forecasters.
Yeah, it was kind of the bad news up front with that drop from 2% to 1%. But the future years, there was actually the catch-up growth was higher than projected. So it it was a bit of a washout. So she could lean on that to be slightly optimistic. But that goes with the caveat that traditionally, the Office for Budget Responsibility of all the kind of forecasters does tend to be the more optimistic one. And a lot of the growth and the positive economic news from this report is relying quite strongly on the assumptions around productivity. Now, they took a hit for last year and for this year, but they are still assuming that it will rise at a rate of about 1.3%, which is not brilliant by any means, but that's what's driving a lot of the hope for growth. Now, if that doesn't turn up, or if some of the kind of other headwinds in the global economy that the Chancellor was hinting at turn up, then the headroom that she's recreated, with going back exactly to 9.9%, could easily be ate away again.
And so much of it simply beyond the Chancellor's control, as we're talking about tariffs, potentially hotting up in the US. And what's the fantastic quote, the John Kenneth Galbraith quote: "The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable." I always think of that at this time of year. Steve, you mentioned productivity and the sort of the optimism that we might actually be about to see some gains in productivity. Is that, are we pinning everything on AI in the way that perhaps in the past we used to pin everything on the blockchain? Is it sort of, are we hoping that this time it's really going to make a difference?
Well, the cynic in me says I hope not. To a certain extent, that you do hear a lot of very optimistic noises coming out of the government about what AI could do, and that's at the moment an unproven kind of thing in terms of the evidence. Kind of reminds me of what Robert Solow said in the 80s about computers, that you could see them everywhere except in the productivity figures. They did eventually, turn up, and AI does have a lot of potential, but it's not necessarily potential in every industry. And there is also the question of how much potential that is about kind of replacing labour rather than complementing labour. Overall, I think we have to take these figures and this projection with a grain of salt, because if you look, there's always a famous graph that's produced at these times of all the projections on terms of productivity that the OBR present, and as it turns out, and it's called a hedgehog graph because the projections are always spike up and reality is a little bit more flatter. So it's still, as ever, a kind of question of wait and see.
Steve, what is the risk to the Chancellor? Because essentially, if we just heard, she's ruled out increasing taxes on working people. She has already taxed businesses, and you can kind of hear Kirsty perhaps feeling a bit nervous about what that might mean for her business, for her sector, for future growth. I mean, where can the Chancellor go if by the time we come to the autumn statement, we have seen a trade war hot up that has increased our borrowing costs. And we are in a position where the Chancellor needs to either break her fiscal rules, tax more, or cut more. I mean, they all seem pretty unpalatable.
Yeah, completely. And I'd say that she really is kind of running out of road on this to a certain extent, because you played a clip from her before, and it was a kind of an element of tell me you're talking about Trump without talking about Trump. This idea that the figure, the 9.9 billion, is enough headroom with all the turmoil that we see in the world at the moment doesn't feel realistic. The rhetoric was the world has changed, but this didn't feel like a fiscal statement that acknowledged that. To a certain extent, we need to think about how we organize our economy more than we do. The world has changed in so many ways. Structurally, we are all. That's a good thing. It's good that we're living longer, but there are costs along with that. And generally in this country, that means we deal with that via the NHS, public spending. Are we going to pay for that? If we're going to pay for that, we're going to need increased revenue. Also, it looks like the peace dividend of the last 30, 40 years has gone. So we're going to need to pay more for defence. The 2.5% that we're promising doesn't feel like it's enough compared to what Europe are gearing up to pay. So already it's projecting tax is going to be at a historic high, but it's probably going to have to go higher. And I think, politically, it makes sense to break that pledge sooner rather than later.
What Trump's announced overnight is not the whole of that worst case scenario, but it's elements of it, and it's the beginning of that risk.
It's not the whole of the worst case scenario, Steve. I mean, that doesn't sound very optimistic, does it? What is the worst case scenario?
I don't know. It could change. We find out finally on, I think, being called Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, where Trump announces his reciprocal tariffs, whether we're in the firing line for that. Now, we could well be, because one of the arguments that the Trump administration are making, that levying VAT on imports, so like basically imports in from the US, they are viewing that as an unfair tariff. And therefore, by reciprocal, they can put 20% on tariffs of UK goods. That's obviously going to really impact demand. So as you kind of highlighted, the OBR worst case scenario is taking that into effect. And that basically every nation responds in kind, so going to full trade war. So for the UK situation, again, it means that 9.9 billion headroom we can wave goodbye to. And so the Chancellor, and by extension the country's problems, get worse. But this, to a certain extent, highlights the problem that the Chancellor faces. Realistically, for some more stability, she would want to have higher headroom than she has. But there are so many demands in terms of public spending, in terms of investment, and so forth, that need to be met. So worst case scenario, pretty bad.
Worst case scenario, pretty bad. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? We know that, the BBC understands that the UK government is trying to negotiate. We've heard from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister that they don't want to sort of throw fuel on the fire. They don't want to kind of say anything that might escalate things. But when we talk about escalation, Stephen, and you're sort of hesitant to outline what the worst case scenario could be, we know that Donald Trump has threatened far larger tariffs if Europe works with Canada to do what he describes as economic harm to the US. I mean, it does seem to be a situation that could continue to escalate even beyond 25% tariffs.
Yes, it could. And it's concerning, but also, it can have real implications. But we're not talking about economic catastrophe in that respect. Macro economies are kind of big ships to a certain extent. So there will be losses there. But at the same time, there is options and potential for kind of decisions like on the longer term. But there's going to be choppy water, definitely, in the periods in between, especially because We still is an open question how much we can believe the administration. I think we're getting to believe more and more. We're having less of the kind of hokey-cokey around tariffs than we've seen in the past. But yeah, there's still so much uncertainty out there.
It used to be said, look at what Donald Trump does, not necessarily what he says. But this particular term in office, he seems to be doing a lot more of what he says. Steve, we're gonna let you crack on with your Friday. Thank you so much for joining us on Wake Up to Money.
Super. See you again soon.
Thank you. Speak to you very soon. Dr. Steve Nolan there, lecturer in economics at Liverpool John Moores University.